Jeff, what a privilege and honor it is to have you here on the Rev Rx Podcast with us today, brother. Thanks for joining us.
Looking forward to our conversation today, Chad. So
Yes,
thanks
sir.
for having me on.
I followed your work for a little while, and one of the things I love about you is that you're kind of like myself. You have a foot in two different worlds, don't you? You're in the faith world. You're working for reasons to believe, and really doing great work when it comes to helping people understand kind of what does it look like to really follow God in our modern world. But then you're also a researcher, and you can talk more about this in a minute, as an astrophysicist. And so you're a science man, you're a faith man. And I find myself very much relating to that too. But I'd love to just kind of hear where this all began. Can you just walk us through how you became the Jeff Zweerink that we know today with, this doing the work that we're seeing in the world?
Sure. I can just say from as young as I can remember, I've been interested in science. One of my earliest memories was watching my dad do a science demonstration. I'm sitting at the top of the stairs, or older brother, is downstairs with a group he's involved with. My dad's doing a demonstration, dipping ball in liquid nitrogen, throwing it on the wall and it shatters, lighting things and mixing chemicals together. And I just remember I've seen demonstrations like that, and there's just a fascination of how does science work? The idea that you can explain all these things, it kind of looks like magic, but it's not. It's actually, we know the reasons why it works. In fact, that's the cool part, is that the more you know, the more fascinating it gets. And so I've just been interested in how do things work? How can I understand, that kind of the way I describe being a physicist is, you ask the question, what's going on here? How is this working? And then you proceed to explore and figure out what the answer to that is. And so, growing up, I was not your stereotypical memorize all the dinosaur names type person, but I loved interacting and thinking and talking about stuff. The other early memory I have is my mom and dad being baptized in the 102 River outside St. Joseph, Missouri, where I grew up. So this is like I was 3 years old watching my dad doing the demonstration. I would think I was 4 years old seeing my parents be baptized. And so just these two aspects of understanding how the world works and being a Christian have been an integral part of my life for as long as I can remember. And it's, as I've grown, my interest in studying science has continued to grow. But as I grew older, my interest in knowing what Christianity is about. So I can say I'm a Christian because my parents taught me about Christianity. That's why I became a Christian. I can say I'm a Christian now because I'm convinced it's true. So I've done studies of, I went on a summer mission trip and kind of learned what it means to share your faith and to study the Bible. And so I've been, over the past 35, 40 years, been digging into the scriptures, trying to understand, what does it say? What does Christianity mean? How do I live in a way that honors and glorifies God? And as I have grown in my ability to do science and produce good scientific work, I've grown in my ability to follow Christ. I've found them to be mutually reinforcing of one another, that the stronger I grow in my Christianity, the more I want to know what's going on in the world. The more I know what's going on in the world, the more convinced I am of the truth of Christianity.
Yeah. I love that. And, there seems to be this perceived science-faith gap, right? And I remember wrestling with that early on. I was in college, and I've always, same way, been fascinated by science. I'm a why guy. Like, it's cool to see the world, but I want to know why. Why does it do that? What's the cause of that? And, my studies have kind of taken me into the human body. And so in the pharmacy field, it's like, all right, why does this happen in the body? And how can we fix that? Yours has kind of taken you into the world that we see around us. And so different paths, but a lot of the same underlying thoughts, what's going on in the world around me and why. And then there's this aspect of Christianity where we have to really practice this whole big word called faith, right? And so when you look at what is faith, faith is the evidence of things unseen. It's kind of this, we think about faith as, all right, I can't see it, but I believe it anyway. And sometimes that can be hard for us science-minded people to grasp, right?
It is, and I will say that I think that leads to a misleading understanding of what biblical faith is. Because when I think of an example of biblical faith, the story I like to tell, I love the description in Matthew 11 of John the Baptist. Here's John the Baptist. He is to the best we can tell, just lived his life pointing the way towards the Messiah. I mean, he recognized Jesus while he was still in the womb. He's out doing his public ministry, and when Jesus comes, he baptizes Jesus. And when Jesus comes up out of the water, the Spirit descends from the heaven like a dove, alights on his shoulders, the voice from heaven, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." I mean, if anybody should have known who Jesus is, it's John the Baptist.
That's right. That's right.
And yet you get this description in Matthew 11 where John the Baptist is about to be beheaded or die. And so he sends message by way of his disciples to Jesus. "Are you the one, or should we look for another?" I mean, in some level, there's not a more ludicrous question. But Jesus' response wasn't, "Oh, come on, John, you just got to believe. Come on, John." It's like, what did Jesus do? Jesus gave him the evidence. You know what Messiah is, and I love the form of the evidence. He says, you know what the Messiah is supposed to do. So he said, go and tell John what you've seen and heard. The lame walk, the deaf hear, all of these things that are the evidence that he's the Messiah. And so that idea of faith, which is I'm believing what I can't see, kind of leads to this idea of a blind faith, when in reality, I think what God is calling us to is a faith that rests confidently. We're putting our faith in something that is confident and reliable.
Yes.
And so, John, at that point in time, he's like, yes, that's the Messiah. I'm going to have faith in Jesus as the Messiah, and I'm willing to die for that. It's a confident trust in a reliable source. So I think Christianity and God is an incredibly reliable source. So I'm choosing to put my faith in that. In the same way, I think science is a great tool to understand how the physical world actually works. And so I put my faith in what science has found as well, because I think they're both trustworthy and reliable sources.
Absolutely. And I kind of led you a little bit with that question. And I was hoping you would make that distinction for us, because, there is plenty of evidence. When you look at how God has worked in this world, how God continues to work in this world, there's evidence of what he's doing. A lot of times we're maybe not in tune with that. Maybe we're not aware of that. And maybe we need to be, like John, reminded of that fact so that our faith grows. But you're absolutely right. It's not just this mindless faith that we're called to have. It's and I want you to state that definition again, because I absolutely love it. It's a belief in something that is reliable.
Yeah. Well, and I'm stealing it from my colleague Ken Samples. We were talking about that, and historically speaking, Christian faith is confident trust in a reliable source. So there's a confidence that, yes, I'm sure this is going to happen, but the faith also needs to be placed in a reliable source.
Yeah. Right.
And so it seems to me those both flow together. And, if I could, there's just an illustration where I found this to be practically played out in my life, because, I've had this discussion, blind faith or whatever. And so when I was finished graduate school, had taught for a year, and then I grew up in the Midwest, and abruptly I moved out to California. Now, neither my wife or I wanted to move to California. When we were moving, my wife was pregnant. My wife was having back problems. All our family's in the Midwest. I've never been in California outside of the job interview that I just went out to take. Didn't want to move there, had no idea where to live or anything like that. But I basically just packed up, said, all right, we're going to rent something over the phone and drive out there and hope it works. Now, that looks like blind faith, if you will. The reality of it is, I've seen my parents be Christians and live that out, and I see what it has brought, the stability and the confidence and the security it has brought to our family. I have personally had experiences with God where he's answered my prayers. I have studied his word and see that it is trustworthy. It's a good description of the physical world and of the spiritual world. I have, in leading up to that decision to move, I'm like, I was actually praying to God. I said, okay, I get the sense it seems pretty strongly you're leading us out there. I can't just drag my wife along. She needs to be on board. And both of us had conversations. We're willing to move most anywhere. We just don't want to live in California. So here God said, all right, let's move to California.
Never say never, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so I said, I can't just drag her. I need her to be on board. And so after I get back from seeing this that job advertisement, I said, I kind of came to my wife and I said, I saw this job advertisement. I think God might be leading us there. And her response was, I'm expecting, pushback or whatever. And her response was, well, if that's where God's leading, let's go. And so it's like, so the moving out there looks like it's like, oh, you have no reason to believe this is a good idea, except I've seen God as this confident or this reliable source that I can put my confident trust in.
That's a really good story. And it really shows us how, when you look at it, when we see how faithful God has been in the past, whether that be with us, whether that be with our parents, whether that be with I think that's one of the important things about being a part of a local church is because we have those testimonies from all the people of God around us that encourage our faith, that build our faith, that make it stronger. But when we see his faithfulness in the past, it just reminds us that he's going to be faithful now. And that is something that is extremely reliable. And I think that's a much better definition of faith than, okay, I just got to blindly believe it and, just leave the rest to God. I mean, there is a place for believing God when you can't see for example, the issues of, you might have heard explained this way, just take the next step. You don't have to see the whole staircase. Right. But when you go back to it, you know that there is something reliable about the God that you serve that's going to bless you when you take that step of obedience, even when you can't see the entire picture. So I love how you kind of reconcile those things.
No, and I think that's important. There is just this very pervasive idea that science is about facts and reason and logic, and faith is about belief and emotions and what you want. And the reality of it is, we all, if we take faith as the definition of putting a confident trust in a reliable source, we all do that.
Yeah.
The question is, what source are we putting our faith in?
100%.
So now we're just, if we take that definition of faith, now the question we're asking is, what's the most reliable source? Where can I find a place where it's like, yes, that is a source that is worthy, or that I can confidently put my trust in? Because there's lots of ideas out there that people firmly believe they have faith in, but I just don't think they're not going to deliver what that source has promised it's going to.
Sure. Yeah. Anything other than faith in God is going to fail you. And that's essentially what we're saying. And odds are, I'm going to make this statement. It sounds like maybe what you're saying here is that we all have faith in something.
Exactly.
We've all placed our faith in something. The question is it the most reliable thing that we know? And that's God. And if not, then hey, you might be disappointed there. So I love how you reconcile that. I love one of the things that I've read that you've said, and I wanted to ask you about this and ask you to maybe expound on this just a little bit with your personal studies. And so it's this comment that science is a powerful tool to declare God's glory. And I've seen that. I've seen that in my realm of the physical body. Science is a powerful tool to declare God's glory. A lot of times we see science and faith as incompatible. There just seems to be this pervasive thought out there that those things are incompatible. And I'm with you. Those things are not enemies. Those things are extremely compatible. And one of the ways I see that's in the human body. I mean, look how intricately our bodies are designed. You can't get very far into the human body without saying, wow, God is an artist and God is an engineer. And just the intricacies of all this. So can you explain a little bit with the work you've done in the astrophysicist world, for lack of a better term, that has really shown God's glory on display?
I appreciate your comment there, but when you think of what life does, it is incredible. I mean, and I see that from the standpoint of, we try and build computer programs that can mimic human behavior. We try and build materials that mimic healing properties of skin and stuff like that. And we're actually drawing inspiration from how life actually does it to do that. I think in my next life, I might be interested in delving into that a little more. I just found the physics more interesting, but I see that same sort of intricacy, and things are put together incredibly well. There are places where if it doesn't work, if it's not just right, it doesn't work. One example that I like to give is that we live in a universe, or our existence in this universe, virtually everybody agrees, relies on abundant carbon and abundant water. And so to get carbon, you obviously have to have carbon. To get water, you have to have hydrogen and oxygen. And so what's from a how would we expect the universe to develop standpoint, you've got hydrogen as the lightest element, so you would expect there to be abundant hydrogen. Then helium is next, and then lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. So if you were to just naively say, given how elements were made in the early universe, you basically have things are hot enough, and so you've got two neutron and a proton will come together, another proton, that makes helium now. You'd expect then lithium and then beryllium. You'd expect the abundances to go hydrogen, helium, lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon.
Yeah, going through the periodic table there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Just because you're building them up one at a time. Well,
right.
God has structured the laws of physics such that that process gets short-circuited right after helium. And without going into all the details, but as you work through it, what that means, well, if you're going to have chemistry or biochemistry, especially, hydrogen has to be abundant, not just to make water, but also to make all of the organic compounds that life requires. So as we're looking at how the laws of physics are structured, there's this intricate balance so that in the early universe, hydrogen fuses into helium, but not into a whole bunch of other stuff, so there's no hydrogen left. And those same laws of physics facilitate the abundant production of carbon and oxygen in stars so that the building blocks that life requires are abundant. So when you look at the most abundant elements in the universe, it's hydrogen and helium, as you would expect, but then carbon and oxygen are the next two. So it's actually our understanding of how the universe works reveals the intricacy and the design and the engineering of it. And I don't think you even mentioned God's not just an engineer, he's an artist. There's an elegance with which he's done all of this process as well.
Right. On one of the interviews that you gave, you talked about the orange flags in New York.
Right.
I love that because you're like, it looks like Home Depot. Can we talk about that just a little bit? Because I want to hone in on the fact that God is an artist, that an engineer and an artist, what's the difference between those things? Because I think a lot of times we lose the beauty of God's work. And one of the things that you're doing is you're kind of showing that beauty. So can you talk about that story just a tad for my listeners so that so we can discuss the beauty and the artistry of the God we serve?
Right. Well, so the background of this story is when I think it would have been probably between 2001 and 2005, just given where in my career that would have happened, is I was out in New York for a collaboration meeting, and there was a artistic display. It was called The Gates, and I forget the exact person who funded it, but they basically, it was like millions of dollars that they'd put forward to generate all of these orange flags and ribbons, and they'd hung them around the city. And so you're just walking through and you see all of this art. And what from an engineering standpoint, I kind of looked about that, and there's almost like, what a waste. I mean, there's millions of dollars, and for the kind of I will just be candid. I don't have it's hard for me to appreciate art. I almost don't know it well enough to appreciate
it. Same. Yeah.
So I'm walking around, from a physics or an engineering standpoint, I look, it's like, wow, what a waste. This is something that really doesn't do anything to the city. It kind of makes it look like Home Depot, and that money could have been spent on science experiments or a better planetarium or feeding the poor or something. The engineer in me has that sort of look to it. There's an efficiency that is missed in the way that money was using. But whoever did that, I may not appreciate the art, but they're looking and saying, I can be extravagant to show this sort of beautiful thing. And just because it's lost on me doesn't mean that's not what's going on, because a lot of the most incredible pieces of art and the things that we find awe-inspiring are, by an engineering standpoint, wasteful. It's like, oh, that could have been done better. We could have done it that way. It could have been, but it's the amount of time and the resources that are spent that kind of give the art its value. So it shows the value the artist had to it. So whoever made that thought $20 million, yeah, that's a lot of money, especially back in the early 2000s. but this person thought it's worth it because this is valuable. And so now I take and apply that to the universe. If this universe is just about can we have life in it, God could have very easily said, all right, all we really need for life, let's make it interesting. We'll just make a whole solar system. And so there's going to be a sun that generates light. There's going to be an earth that orbits around it. There's going to be a moon. There's going to be water. You could make almost everything about what life requires here on Earth with just having the solar system. You might even argue that, having the sun is extraneous because you could find some other way to generate the heat. Or you could engineer that down with much fewer. But let's just say that we're the only life in the universe, and all that the universe is doing is about producing life. Now, we live in a universe that has 1 trillion galaxies in it. That's not a million, that's a million millions of galaxies. And most of those galaxies have on the order of 100 billion to 1 trillion stars in them. That is a whole lot of stars. As a chemist, you will appreciate this. So that's about 10 to the 23. Well, what other number comes with 10 to the 23? Well, that's a mole has that in that. So a gram of hydrogen has, or maybe it's a kilogram, I always forget which, has 10 to the 23 atoms in it. So that's that many stars in the universe. It's kind of akin to the number of grains on the surface of the earth, grains of sand, that though God could have had life in this very efficient way, he chose, from a resource perspective, a very extravagant way of doing it.
Wow.
And we now also, when we look out in the heavens, we get to study the heavens and we see, wow, there's a awe-inspiring humongousness of it.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a beauty about it as well, because there are some incredibly cool pictures we've been able to take from our telescopes.
Yeah.
And we find that there are planets around other stars, and we find things out about our planet by exploring the other planets in our solar system and these other planets, that universe functions very well for life to be here. But there's a beauty about it that transcends what needs to be there for the function to happen.
Yeah.
And so I think God is an artist. We create because God is a creator.
Yeah.
Our artists because God is an artist.
Yeah. I love that. And you see his beauty all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
You see his hand in all of the heavens. I've seen some of those pictures from the Hubble telescope and some of the others, and I mean, I just stare at them.
Huh?
And maybe that's because I'm not an astrophysicist, but I just stare at them and I get lost. I'm just like, that is crazy. That is that far out there, that far away, and yet we can see it. And so it's just awesome that we serve a God who is so extravagant and who appreciates the beauty. He is beauty. He is beautiful. He shows us, he creates in a way that is beautiful. And in a way, I think that beauty is a part of the creation called humans too.
Well, I'm curious. So you live in Georgia there. I don't know if you've ever been to the aquarium there. That's in Atlanta, but it's got, it's I think maybe the only aquarium in the world that has whale sharks in it. And so I remember just being in there, being fascinated by these creatures just because of their size. But there's also part of what I find fascinating about that is that it's so outside the normal of what I normally experience. So, we alluded to the fact that the human body is incredibly well designed. But honestly, I kind of just take it for granted because I see, it's like, I'll get a cut on my eye, I know it's going to heal. There's a routineness that in that routineness, I miss some of the spectacular. It almost seems like God has done things in a way so that to appreciate some of it, you have to work pretty hard to even be able to see it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that we still get to see glimpses instead of everything just becoming run of the mill and routine. God's given us the ability to put in the effort to appreciate what's going on. And in doing that, we actually appreciate it even more. I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think some of those grandiose marvels, we'll call them that we see that are reminders of God at work and of God's beauty and of his masterpiece and of how well he can create. I think those kind of inspire that sense of awe, don't they? And you're right. When we're used to something, when it becomes routine and mundane, we lose that sense of awe because it's just what we're used to. And a lot of times with the human body, what I see is that we take it for granted until things don't work right.
Right.
Right. So as we age, I turned 40 this year, and so I can attest to this. As we age, things stop working the way that they're supposed to. These bodies aren't made to last forever.
Well, and I can tell you, being a little older, it only gets worse.
Appreciate that, Jeff.
Not to encourage or discourage you.
Word of hope this morning. But yeah, so I think that God reminds us. It's kind of a God wink of sorts, I think, when we see things, when we look up, and there's times where we live out in the country, and I look up and there's not city lights nearby, and I look up and I'm just in awe at the sky with
Yes.
all the stars.
Mm-hmm.
I go to the aquarium and I see the big whale sharks, and I see all of the unique animals, all the unique creatures that God made. And you're right, it's all around us, and sometimes we miss it. But when we see those unusual, those majestic, those grandiose things, when we go to the Grand Canyon, when we see things like that, I think God uses those things to remind us, hey, look at the beauty that I've created, and that same beauty's in you, even though you don't see it all the time.
Right.
I love that. Yeah, there's this familiarity that I think comes along with it, and we're just like, oh yeah, that's cool.
So did you get to see the Northern Lights perchance in any of these last couple of things that have happened? Because
Yeah, a little bit.
Way south.
Yeah, a little bit. And it was one of those. I'm not sure why. You could probably explain this to me. You could see it better with the phone than you could with the naked eye. But yeah, there was definitely a hue that we could see, and that was one of those moments, where it's like, what in the world? Like, the sky is not supposed to look like this.
Right.
And, we get used to the same sky. But when we see something like that, that's just another example of the beauty and the artistry of God.
Yeah, no, I was kind of disappointed that I wasn't able, we live in Los Angeles, so the skies are pretty bright. We're also quite a way south. But oddly enough, I've been able to see the Northern Lights 3 times in my life, which, just over 50. So it's like periodically I get to see it. But one time I was probably 10-ish years old, and there was just kind of this red glow in the sky. And I thought, oh, that's kind of cool. And then about 20 years later, I guess it was late high school or late college, I was up in Minnesota and got to see them. And there was kind of this greenish hue in the sky. But the most spectacular time, believe it or not, I was down in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I was working on a telescope down there that it's a gamma ray telescope, and it's very light sensitive. And so when the moon comes up, when things get bright, we just can't run because it'll burn up our detectors. Well, I'm sitting here running the telescope, and it just shuts down. And it's this gorgeous night out. I thought, oh, well, that's weird. So I turn it back on, and about half a minute later, it shuts down again. And so I get in the elevator, go down to the floor, walk out, and I look up across the northern sky, and there's just this curtain of red and white light of the Northern Lights. I'm like, it's 3 a.m. The only reason I see it is because I'm running this telescope that happens to shut off when it gets too light. But one of the more spectacular sights I've seen. And I still, it's just etched in my mind because it's so uncommon for me to see stuff.
Absolutely. It's those uncommon moments I think God uses to remind us. And, when I take my kids to school every morning, we pass by, I'm in rural Georgia. So we passed by some cotton fields, and just over the crest of the hill where the cotton fields are, and right now they're beautiful. They're, got all the cotton on them. The sun rises. And right now, during this time of year, before we fall back into a different time, but on the way to school, the sun's rising, just popping right over the hill. And the sky is beautiful. On a clear day, the sky is absolutely beautiful. And so I try to not lose that moment. And so when the kids are in the back seat, I'm like, hey guys, look at the sky. And they're probably tired of me saying, hey guys, look at the sky. It looks the same every morning. But it's one of those things. I just don't want you to forget how incredible God is. I don't want you to forget how extravagant God is. And, just the hues that come up that are, it starts with this bright orange and then kind of fades into like a pink. That's not something we should ever really lose our wonder at, even if it becomes frequent. And so I like talking through this because it reminds us that, God's beauty is everywhere. We just have to look for it.
Well, and I think there's something profound about that in the way that science plays out. Because if you look at it, we've been doing science as a concerted enterprise for, let's say, 400 years. Whether it's 5, whether it's 3, doesn't change my point. that we have learned an incredible amount about this universe and the
Hmm.
time. So let's just kind of stick within physics. We've learned about the basic fundamental interactions between things. We've got most of the fundamental particles mapped out. We've kind of got a picture of how all that could be unified into a single theoretical umbrella. I mean, we've made tremendous strides in figuring out how the universe works. Yet, in the midst of doing all of that, there is no real sense of, oh, we're just about done. And part of that is because we've thought that in the past, thinking,
Yeah.
oh, we're just about done. We're kind of mopping up details, and then we discover something new that was like, oh, we didn't even know to think about that. That the more we understand, the more we dig in, the more we see there's so much we weren't even aware of.
Yeah.
And I think if that's correct, we will never cease to be finding things to be awed and in wonder about, because that's the way God his revelation is inexhaustible. We can learn and grow and know more and more, and we will never exhaust it. And there's always fascinating, awe-inspiring things.
That's what I was about to say. Isn't that how God works?
Right.
We can't exhaust him. And he reveals to us, if he revealed to us everything there was to know about him, about this universe or whatever, we would be so overwhelmed. Like our human finite minds couldn't handle that. And so it's like he gives us a little bit at a time. Like in my walk with God, I've learned more about him in the last few years than I knew about him before. If God had given me everything all at one time, I wouldn't have known what to do with that. And yet still, it's the tip of the iceberg compared to what there is still to know about him. And it's the same way with the universe, right? I absolutely love that concept because it shows us that, the same things can be said about God as can be said about his creation.
Yes. Well, and it's funny because I've run into, kind of family members and other people who there's almost a little bit of repulsion about the idea of heaven because it's forever.
Yeah.
There's a part to where they just can't fathom forever, because at some point I'm going to get bored with that.
Right.
And I think what gets missed as I've thought about that, why doesn't that bother me, is that I think I've realized, and my answer to that would be that I'm not just doing a bunch of stuff and I'm going to get tired of it. I'm going to be knowing God more and more and more. And my finite amount of what I can know will never be bored of the infinite reservoir of who God is. And so it's not like I'm going to get to heaven and it's like, all right, we kind of get everything summed up. We got all the details worked out. And now let's play our harps and sing Kumbaya for the rest of eternity. No, it's like there's no end of, oh, that's so cool. And then you work at it, oh, that's so cool. And that's what we're going to be doing for eternity.
Yeah. Some of the most exciting moments of my life have been those moments of revelation, to where I find out more about God. I find out more about who he is. He reveals something to my heart, to my soul, that just blows my mind. And, there's really no better feeling than knowing that you're communing with the God of the universe, and you're understanding him more. So what a great way to think about eternity, is that we're going to be constantly in that process, one mind-blowing moment after another, of just understanding and knowing our God more and more and more. Man, what a powerful, I get chill bumps thinking about that. That's incredible. Thanks for sharing that illustration with us.
I am increasingly, I will just, you made a statement about, knowing more and more about God. And I am continually amazed at how poor my understanding has been of him. And how patient he is to allow me to come to that realization.
Right. So thankful for his patience, for sure.
Absolutely.
Well, one of the things you said, and we'll kind of start wrapping up here, but one of the things you said was, if we're alone in this universe, and you've written a book about that, and can we go there just a little bit to help us kind of think about, all right, is there life out there? Are we it? And then kind of what are some of the biblical ramifications of the answer to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned earlier that there's this popular idea that science and faith are in conflict with one another, or science and Christianity are in conflict with one another. And when you get in and explore, you realize it's just not the case. You can talk about Christianity in a way that's antagonistic towards science, and you can talk about science in a way that's antagonistic towards Christianity. But historically, that's not where the data lies.
It's kind of caricatures, right?
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's I see a similar thing at play with the idea of thinking about life out there. There's one way of looking at it. It's like, well, we're here, so obviously it's got to be common and it can work out. And there's a lot of things that need to happen for life. I mean, our universe is life friendly in that it's produced a lot of carbon and oxygen, and there's abundant hydrogen, and planets form and stars. But then there's also an aspect of life where it requires kind of exacting conditions, and we take for granted how common those exacting conditions might be because they happen here on Earth. I mean, when you think about when the Earth first formed, Earth's average global temperature has been in about a 20 degrees Celsius window. Now, the sun was 30% dimmer than it is today.
Yeah.
So it's gotten much brighter, and the Earth has stayed in that temperature window. The atmosphere has changed dramatically from having no oxygen in it to now 10% or 20% oxygen, actually 21% oxygen. Went from a carbon dioxide dominated atmosphere to a nitrogen dominated atmosphere. We went from a continent that had virtually no land mass to one that is about 30% covered in land mass. It went from no to very primitive life to this complex array of life. Any one of these things could have, aside from like being hit by large asteroids and making things that made the moon and everything, any one of these things could have made Earth uninhabitable. Yet in the midst of all of these incredibly dramatic changes, there's been this stability about Earth's temperature that allows life to not only exist, but to thrive. So to say, yeah, well, it's just going to be throughout, there's been a really remarkable symphony of events that have conspired to make Earth so habitable. But there's another scenario that comes up is like, well, if we found life out there, that means all of the world's religions, they're just Earth-based and human ideas, and they didn't think of that, and you just have to rewrite them all. Well, you go push at Christianity, and what you find is that long before science ever even got a seat at the table, Christians have thought about what happens if we find life out there.
Wow.
You've got two very devout Christians. Galileo thought that life only existed here on Earth, that God had only created life here on Earth. His contemporary, Kepler, also a devout Christian, thought God had created life on all the different planets. He thought it was everywhere out there. So this isn't something where Christianity has said, well, there's only life here, and when we find life, it's going to have us to rewrite the game. No, Christians have thought about this in terms of how does it work in terms of God being the creator and fall and redemption and consummation. And Christians have thought about this for millennia, and science is the newcomer to the discussion. And
right.
So what I found is that stereotype of, oh, if we find life, that means Christianity is going to be wrong. It just really isn't the case.
Yeah. And, what we're seeing is that with every new scientific discovery, with all the progress that we've made, it all really confirms God, doesn't it?
It does.
It proclaims his glory. It confirms that, he's the author and creator of everything that we know. And I really see, all right, so there's some sticking points for some people. We won't get into it for time's sake, but there's some sticking points. But really, that's just stuff that's undiscovered. That's stuff that we just don't, we think we know, but we probably don't. And so what I really like is just these conversations, normalizing these conversations where we can say, let's talk about some of these hard questions. Let's ask, is there life out there? It's okay to think about that. It's okay to, to think about Christianity and science belonging together. It's okay to think about them being linked in a way. And so the work that you're doing, my friend, is incredible. The work that Reasons to Believe is doing is incredible as well. And I'd like to just give you an opportunity. Can you tell my listeners where to find out more information about you, Reasons to Believe, and then also with the books that you've authored?
Yeah, so the best place to go find out about Reasons to Believe is our website, reasons.org. There's a wealth of material on there. There's a lot of resources there, and if you're willing to dig in, you're not going to be disappointed there. We are on social media, RTB_official for that, RTB_J Zweerink for me specifically. Those are probably the best ways to connect and communicate. But again, lots of resources out there. As you can tell, if you look at the titles of my book, Who's Afraid of the Multiverse, talking about the multiverse. Is there life out there? Talking about, well, is there life out there? And then there's another one, Escaping the Beginning, which is actually a big question. Is there really a beginning to the universe? You can see I like asking questions and exploring, what does this actually mean? And so those are some resources out there. And I've also been a co-author on a devotional series that called Impact Events. That's kind of gives a chance to explore and think about, how does this actually play out in your life, rather than being a nice academic topic you can talk about, but just making it more practical in terms of how do we live day to day.
Yeah, I love it. And I appreciate the questions that you're asking. I appreciate the curiosity through which you approach the world. And I think really the purpose of this conversation was to kind of just help us think about some of those things. And so hopefully this whets the appetite of my listeners. This hasn't been all inclusive by any stretch, Jeff. I feel like we could probably have a conversation for about 5 or 6 hours about this kind of stuff. But man, this has been powerful. This has been great. Thank you, my friend. What a privilege and honor it is to have you here on the show.
I've appreciated being here. And if you ever come up with a topic and you want to come back, I would love to come back. Had a fascinating time here just engaging.
Yeah, sounds good, Jeff. Thanks so much.